It was 1907, and Bass Reeves was 69 years old. He'd been a deputy U.S. Marshal for 32 years, had arrested over 3,000 outlaws, had survived shootouts that should have killed him a dozen times over. But this arrest was different. This one hurt in a way that bullets never could. Reverend William Turner had been the spiritual leader of the small African-American church in Muskogee for almost 20 years. He was a good man, everyone said so. A man who preached temperance on Sundays and visited the sick on Mondays. A man who'd married couples, buried the dead, and baptized the children of former slaves who were trying to build new lives in Oklahoma Territory. Bass Reeves had been one of those baptisms. It was back in 1889, not long after Bass's first wife, Nellie, had died. Bass was broken in those days, hollowed out by grief, questioning everything he'd ever believed about justice and fairness and God's plan. He'd spent 30 years enforcing the law. But the law hadn't saved Nellie from the fever that took her. The law hadn't made her suffering any less. Reverend Turner had found Bass sitting alone in his cabin one evening, a bottle of whiskey on the table and a look in his eyes that scared even him. The preacher didn't preach that night. He just sat down, poured himself a small glass of that whiskey, and talked to Bass like a friend. About loss, about pain, about how a man carries on when everything he loves has been taken from him. The law you enforce out there is man's law, Turner had said quietly. It's important, Bass, but it ain't everything. There's another law, higher than Judge Parker's, higher than the Constitution. And that law says you're loved, even when you're broken. Especially when you're broken. 2 months later, Bass had stood in the creek behind the church while Reverend Turner lowered him into the cold water and raised him up again, reborn. The congregation sang hymns on the bank, their voices carrying across the prairie. Bass had cried that day, the only time anyone could remember seeing tears on the face of the most feared lawmen in Indian Territory. That had been 18 years ago. Now Bass stood in the marshal's office in Muskogee, reading a warrant that accused Reverend Turner of selling illegal whiskey to Creek and Seminole Indians on federal land. Bootlegging. It was a federal crime, carried a mandatory prison sentence. And there were witnesses. Store owners who'd seen Turner making deliveries, Indians who'd bought the whiskey directly from him. The evidence was solid. Marshal Leo Bennett watched Bass's face as he read the warrant. Everyone in the office knew the situation. Knew that Turner had baptized Bass, had presided at his second wedding to Winnie Sumter, had been a fixture in Bass's life for nearly 2 decades. I can give this to someone else, Bennett said carefully. Nobody would blame you for stepping aside on this one, Bass. Bass looked up from the warrant, his face unreadable. Is it true? Did he do it? Bennett nodded. Seems so. The congregation was struggling financially. Church roof was leaking. They couldn't afford to fix it. Some of the men talked Turner into making a little money on the side just until they got the roof repaired. He didn't see the harm in it. Federal law don't care about church roofs, Bass said quietly. No, Bennett agreed. It don't. Bass folded the warrant and slipped it into his vest pocket, right next to his badge. Then I'll serve it. If he broke the law, he answers for it, same as anyone else. The walk to the church was the longest of Bass's life, longer than the 28 miles he'd walked in disguise to catch those 2 brothers, longer than the 2-week hunt for his own son. Every step felt like he was walking towards something that would break him in a way that bullets and outlaws never could. Reverend Turner was in the church when Bass arrived, up on a ladder trying to patch a hole in the roof with a piece of tin and some tar. He looked down when he heard the door open, saw Bass standing in the aisle below, and knew immediately why he'd come. I wondered when you'd get here, Turner said. He climbed down the ladder slowly, his movements careful like a man much older than his 50-some years. I heard they'd issued a warrant. Bass pulled the paper from his pocket. Reverend Turner, I got a warrant here for your arrest on charges of bootlegging and selling liquor on federal land. I'm real sorry, but I got to take you in. Turner nodded, wiping tar from his hands with a rag. I understand, Bass. You're just doing your job. That don't make it right, Bass said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the last word. That don't make it feel any less wrong. Turner walked down the aisle toward him, his footsteps echoing in the empty church. Let me ask you something, Bass. All these years you've been enforcing the law. 32 years now, right? How many times did you want to look the other way? How many times did you want to let someone go because they had a good reason for breaking the law? Bass thought about it. More times than I can count. But you never did you? You never once let your personal feelings get in the way of your duty. Turner smiled sadly. That's why you're the man you are. That's why people respect you, even when they hate you for arresting their sons or their brothers or their friends, because they know you treat everyone the same, rich or poor, white or black or Indian, friend or stranger. The law is the law, and Bass Reeves don't bend it for nobody. He held out his wrists. So don't start now. Don't dishonor what we both believe in just because it's me standing here instead of some outlaw you don't know. Bass pulled out his handcuffs, the same iron shackles he'd used on thousands of criminals. His hands were shaking as he closed them around Turner's wrists. The click of the metal seemed impossibly loud in the silent church. I baptized you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Turner said quietly. And I'll tell you now what I told you then. You are loved, Bass Reeves, even when you're doing something that tears you apart inside, especially then. They walked out of the church together, Bass holding Turner's arm like they were old friends, taking a stroll instead of lawman and prisoner. But everyone who saw them knew what was happening. Word spread through Muskogee's black community like wildfire. By the time they reached the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Turner's wife was there, crying quietly. Members of the congregation were there, some angry, some just sad. They watched as Bass Reeves, the most respected lawman they'd ever known, led their preacher up the courthouse steps in chains. One man, Bass never learned his name, spit on the ground as they passed. You'd arrest your own mama if someone paid you to, the man said bitterly. Bass stopped walking. He turned to face the crowd, his hand still on Turner's arm, his face carved from stone. You're right, he said, his voice carrying across the courthouse square. I would, because the law don't play favorites. The minute it does, the minute we start saying some folks are above the law because we like them, or because they're good people, that's the minute justice dies. And without justice, all we got is might making right. All we got is chaos. He looked at Turner's wife, at the congregation, at the angry faces staring back at him. Reverend Turner broke the law. He had a good reason, the best reason. He was trying to help this church, help this community. But intention don't change the fact of what he did. And if I let him walk because he's my friend, because he baptized me, because I owe him more than I can ever repay, then what do I say to every mother whose son I arrested? What do I say to my own boy, sitting in prison in Kansas for killing his wife? Do I tell them the law applies to everyone except people Bass Reeves cares about? The crowd was silent now. Bass turned back to Turner. I'm sorry, Reverend. I'm sorrier than I got words for. But I got to do this. Turner's eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. I know, son, and I'm proud of you for doing it. The trial was quick. Judge Nathan Williams presided, and the evidence was overwhelming. Reverend Turner pleaded guilty, hoping for leniency. The judge gave him 2 years in federal prison, the minimum sentence under the law. Bass attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching the man who'd saved his soul be condemned by the law he'd spent his life enforcing. When the sentence was read, Turner turned and found Bass in the crowd. He nodded once, a gesture of understanding, maybe even approval. Bass nodded back, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. After the trial, Bass tried to visit Turner in prison, but the preacher refused to see him. Sent word through the warden that there was no hard feelings, no anger, but that it would be too painful for both of them to sit across from each other, with iron bars between them. Turner served 18 months before being released early for good behavior. By then, Bass Reeves was dead. Claimed by kidney disease just 3 months after Oklahoma became a state and his federal marshal's commission expired. He never got to see Turner walk free. Never got to hear whether the preacher forgave him or hated him, or just felt the same complicated mix of respect and sorrow that Bass had felt that day in the church. But the story lived on. The story of Bass Reeves arresting the man who baptized him. The man who'd pulled him back from the edge of despair and given him faith when he had nothing else. It became another chapter in the legend, another example of the iron will and uncompromising dedication that made Bass Reeves the most feared and respected lawman in the history of the American frontier. Some people said it proved Bass was cold, that he cared more about the law than about people. But those who knew him understood something different. They understood that arresting Reverend Turner was one of the hardest things Bass ever did. Harder maybe than arresting his own son, because Turner had saved him in a way that went beyond flesh and blood. And, by arresting him anyway, by refusing to let friendship or gratitude corrupt his sense of justice, Bass had honored everything Turner had taught him about doing what's right even when it costs you everything. Years later, after both men were dead and buried in unmarked graves somewhere in Oklahoma, Turner's grandson would tell a newspaper reporter about that day. "My grandfather never spoke ill of Bass Reeves," he said. Said Bass was the finest man he ever knew, precisely because he didn't make exceptions. Said the day Bass arrested him was the day he understood what real integrity looked like. It looks like a man doing his duty even when it breaks his heart, especially when it breaks his heart. That was Bass Reeves. A man who enforced the law without fear or favor, who treated outlaws and preachers exactly the same, who understood that justice only works when it applies to everyone equally, even when everyone includes the people you love most in the world. The warrant for Reverend William Turner's arrest was filed in the federal courthouse in Muskogee, Oklahoma, in 1907. At the bottom, in the space marked Arresting Officer, someone had written in careful script, Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. And next to it, in different handwriting, someone had added a note that would remain in the file for the next 100 years. Even lawmen need the strength to arrest their own souls sometimes.